Well, hello and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. And my name is Steve Kubler. I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. And in today's event, Professor Alta Charo will discuss how technology and public policy affect human reproduction. But before I introduce Professor Charo, I'd like to say a little bit about our speaker series and how you can participate. So Ethically Speaking is organized with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who's professor of ethics and digital culture and founding director of the UCF Center for Ethics. And we developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our times. And we encourage you to visit the center's website, and that's at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu, where you can learn more about our activities and find out about other speakers in our series. And we'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future topics in Ethically Speaking. Ethics, I think, connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives. And the importance of ethics, I hope, at UCF is clear from the long list of partners who support this series. All of you, we hope, enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope this cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Today's event is being recorded, and we will post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. And at the end of the presentation, Professor Charo will take questions moderated by Jonathan. And please submit your questions to Professor Charo directly via chat to Dr. Beaver. So now let me introduce our speaker, and note this is going to take a little bit of time because she is extremely accomplished. Professor Alta Charo is the Warren P. Knowles Professor Emerita of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin. She earned the BA in Biology from Harvard in 1979 and a JD in Law from Columbia in 82. Before joining UW in 1982, Professor Charo held several prestigious fellowships and appointments in public policy, too numerous to name them all, but I'll hit some highlights here in the early years. Those include 3 years with Legislative Drafting Research Fund of Columbia University, a Fulbright Junior Lectureship in American Law at the Sorbonne in Paris, and legal analyst for Biological Applications Program of the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, and fellow in the American Association for the Advancement of Science Diplomacy in the U.S. Agency for International Development. Professor Charo has authored over 150 articles, book chapters, and government reports on law and policy related, and wait for it, to environmental protection, reproductive health, medical genetics, stem cell research, science funding, and research ethics. She served on the advisory board of many research institutes and NGOs, including the Foundation for AIDS Research, the Society for the Advancement of Women's Health, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And currently, she serves as head of bioethics for Colossal Laboratories and Biosciences, which you may recognize as recently making headlines for de-extincting the dire wolf, maybe the topic of a future talk. Professor Charo has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the National Academy of Medicine, 3 different disciplines. And in government, she served as legal or policy analyst for many agencies and was a member of President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Commission and President Obama's Department of Health and Human Services Transition Team. We're truly honored to have Professor Charo with us today. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, and I'll enable slide share for you, Professor Charo.
Well, first, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to take just a moment here to get my slides set up here and to thank everybody for coming on an afternoon when you might
Yeah,
otherwise
they
be
do.
enjoying the beautiful
I've
weather
seen him do it like all.
that
Keep
you
going.
might otherwise be enjoying if since you're in Florida. Here in Washington, D.C., it's gray and gloomy. I'm talking about the weather, not about the political situation. Before I begin, I should just let you know that because I now work as a consultant since I left teaching, I have some potential conflicts. And in yellow are organizations that have at least some arguable connection to what we're going to be talking about today. And so I just wanted to let you know about that. I'm also going to ask that if people have questions that are about clarifying something I said, I could have used an acronym you didn't recognize, I could have used a term in biology that you didn't recognize, please feel free to throw it in the chat, and Dr. Beaver will interrupt me so that I can clarify and then continue on. If it's a more substantive comment, then I believe he is going to be collecting those and moderating toward the end so that we can discuss them all in a kind of integrated fashion. What I want to do is to take advantage of my love for pop culture to introduce a variety of topics related to human reproduction, starting with Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice, to talk about cryopreservation of embryos that have been made using in vitro fertilization and that have subsequently been tested using what is called PGD, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. But to do that, it's helpful to have a very brief history of assisted reproductive technologies. In vitro fertilization, that is, fertilizing an egg in a petri dish outside the human body, goes back to about 1978, developed in the United Kingdom. But it moved pretty rapidly in the 1980s into clinical care in the United States as well. Its primary indication was very limited. It had to do with women who were perfectly fertile, but because of scar tissue in the fallopian tube, an egg was unable to drop down the tube to a place where it could be fertilized through natural intercourse. And so, what IVF did is it removed the egg from the ovaries and then allowed for fertilization to take place outside that normal environment. And then the fertilized egg was placed back in the body for gestation. Um, it became something that was the subject of tremendous policy discussion very quickly, because for the very first time in human history, an embryo was accessible outside the human body, and it raised questions that had never been asked before. Imagine when fertilization takes place through natural intercourse, there's no way to ask the question of who owns the embryo, who controls the embryo, can the embryo be sold, can the embryo be destroyed? These were not questions you could ask. But suddenly, when it's sitting outside the body, it is amenable to all kinds of manipulations and disposition decisions that never existed before. And so the 1980s was a period of a lot of policy discussion around IVF. It was also a period that was pretty soon after the announcement of a constitutional right to have an abortion, at least prior to viability, the so-called Roe versus Wade decision, which was the constitutional law of the United States from 1973 until just a couple of years ago, with a different decision from the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case. And so in the kind of political battles that followed that constitutional finding, we saw that the question about the moral status and therefore arguably the legal status of the earliest developing forms of life began to move beyond the fetus in utero, which was the subject of abortion discussions, and began to move toward all other forms of developing life, and that included now embryos outside the body. So one of the things that happened that was of great significance in both how quickly the field moved forward and whether or not it was subject to regulation was the so-called Dickey-Wicker Amendment. This is now 1995, and it's passed as a rider on other legislation, but it doesn't matter. It gets repassed every time there's another legislative cycle. And basically what it says is that federal money cannot be used to create an embryo for research purposes, and it cannot be used to destroy an embryo, or more accurately, it can't be used in ways that put an embryo at risk of destruction. So what the Dickey-Wicker Amendment functionally accomplished was a removal of the federal government from research support having to do with research on the human embryo. This is crucial because research on the human embryo outside the body was also allowing us to do something never before possible, and that was to begin to study the early forms of human development, the things that go on in those first weeks of development that might account for birth defects or miscarriages, but were essentially a black box when they happened inside a woman's body. And suddenly, studied in a laboratory dish, one could begin to understand them. But at the same time, one could also use the embryo for all kinds of other purposes, like deriving embryonic stem cell lines or destroying the embryo in order to understand both not only normal development, but abnormal development. So Dickey-Wicker removed the federal government from supporting that research. It also meant that it removed what is in the United States a very typical way in which we regulate. Because the federal government, at least in theory under our Constitution, is a government of limited powers. a lot of powers reside at the state level and not at the federal level. So the federal government sometimes is not able to regulate directly. But what it can do is it can regulate indirectly by saying, if you use our federal money, you must do it with these rules. It's kind of like the way we all grew up, where our parents would say, if you live in our house, you're going to do it our way, or you're going to use our money, you're going to do it our way. Same concept. So, very commonly, when you get federal money to, for example, support certain kinds of research, it may come with strings attached, conditions. You can do this, but not that. And we lost that capacity with the Dickey-Wicker Amendment to control the structure of the research. So the research developed in the 80s and 90s, largely free of federal regulatory oversight. It meant that it was regulated by professional self-regulating guidelines, or less frequently by state legislation that filled in the gap where federal regulation didn't exist. So we had now a new situation in which there was research going on that was funded with private money or with state money occasionally, but not federal money, and therefore was regulated by private entity, private funders, by self-regulation, or by states, but not by the federal government. And along the way, we began to see the add-ons to in vitro fertilization. One of the biggest developments was in the area of pre-implantation genetic testing, PGT. It's also known as PGD for prenatal genetic diagnosis. And it began in the 1990s. I know it's a little bit hard to see down here. And then different kinds of technologies are developed until we get to whole genome sequencing now. But basically, the idea is this. With in vitro fertilization, to be efficient, you tend to remove multiple eggs at once. This, by the way, is not a trivial process. It is one that requires that a woman's body be primed for it with various hormonal interventions, and then there's a semi-surgical intervention to retrieve the eggs. This is not something people go through unless they have to. So they're doing it because they have an infertility issue, or they do it because they think they may be carrying a very significant genetic problem and they want to be able to screen out for that problem. So once the embryos are outside the body, it's kind of remarkable. But the embryo, which now looks like, think of it as a miniature basketball made up of a bunch of cells, is really quite resilient. And you can pluck one cell out of that collection of cells and you can test it for various genetic characteristics and determine whether that embryo, whether all the other cells in that embryo are carrying a particular mutation or not that would be dangerous or even lethal to any subsequent fetus or neonate. And so for families that were carrying a potentially dangerous disorder, rather than just foregoing reproduction or using donated eggs or sperm from egg donors and sperm donors, they could make their own embryos and then screen out the embryos that were going to result in failed pregnancies or extremely ill, disabled, or soon to die infants. And so this became an add-on to IVF, and it expanded the indications for IVF somewhat beyond the indication of infertility. But it was really screening for a very limited number of conditions because there aren't that many conditions for which you can actually tell to a high degree of certainty that if you have this trait, you will have this problem. There's a very limited number of so-called Mendelian disorders where it's a single gene mutation that can very, very strongly predict a certain problem. And for those that are caused by multiple genes together, it's often very complicated to figure out how they're going to coordinate and result in a severe form of the illness or a mild form of the illness. So it's very interesting that over the years, we have started to see companies begin to develop business models that suggest that they can actually tell you very strongly what your child is going to emerge like. Here's from 2017. If you have IVF, then PGD or PGS, what genetic testing can tell you about your embryo? It turns out not as much as people think. But despite that, the market for pre-implantation genetic testing has been increasing quite steadily. And you can see that there is this prediction of a multi-billion-dollar market coming in the next few years. We also now have, as of 2024 and 2025, these slides are more recent, an increasing number of companies that are claiming that they can test for a variety of things that are not going to affect a newborn, but are going to be late in life diseases. What is your risk of Alzheimer's disease? What is your risk of things that are poorly understood, like schizophrenia or autism, for which we still don't really understand the mix of genetic and non-genetic influences, let alone which genes or which epigenetic signatures, that is, the things that affect how genes operate, are going to account for this disorder. And yet we've got companies that are forming to try and give people some kind of prediction about what their baby or their child or their, adult child is going to experience in life. And I find it really interesting that these companies are living right on the borderline of where the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA's regulatory authority, lies. You'll notice that there's lots of companies out there, some of you may have used them, that offer various kinds of genetic tests for your ancestry, um, which is just a way of talking about kind of the geographic origins of your family in the past couple of hundred years, because eventually we all go back to the same place in Africa. Um, it's really interesting how poor the mathematics is for this, and yet how much money is rushing into this. And it's rushing in from places like Silicon Valley, which is made up of people who usually are pretty good at math. And the FDA has regulatory authority over things that purport to test in a way that's going to provide a diagnosis. But this exists kind of on the edge. It's not really a diagnosis so much as kind of a prediction. And so, like with ancestry, it's almost like recreational genetics, which kind of falls outside FDA regulatory authority. So we've yet to see exactly who's going to basically govern how well these companies function. Is it going to be just the market and consumer uptake, or is it going to be a regulatory authority? Now, another recent development in this area is so-called heritable genome editing. Now, this is where you take an embryo or you take gametes and you try and change the genes. You can cut the gene that is a mutation, just cut it out completely if it's a problematic gene, or you can substitute in one that is healthier, or you can try and actually take what is a faulty gene and go inside the gene and correct parts of it. So this is something that is a fairly recent development. I'd say probably everybody's heard about CRISPR. That is 2014, 2015 is when that really hits the news. It's a more efficient way of doing this kind of editing, which has been around for a while. But to do it in a way that's heritable is to do it in gametes and embryos so that not only is the resulting child affected, but that child's children down the line would be affected because you did it early enough that you're editing the cells that will populate the entire body, including the future eggs or sperm of that child. Now, the science is not even close to being ready for this kind of effort, regardless of whether you think it's a good idea or bad idea. And yet, despite that, in November 2018, at the summit that we were holding in London, Hong Kong at the time, it was our second summit on genome editing, we heard this announcement from Dr. Hu Zhonghui from Shenzhen in China that he had edited embryos purportedly to provide resistance to HIV. It was crazy because these children were not actually at risk of HIV infection. These were embryos that were going to be gestated by women who themselves were not HIV positive. Their husbands were. And it turns out that if the man is the one who's positive, there are some very effective ways to prevent transmission, and you would not need to do anything like this. But he did it anyway. And he claimed that he was going to edit a particular site called CCR5 that is known to convey resistance to HIV. There's a small population of people in the world that have this particular variant that are resistant to HIV infection. When we actually looked at what he had done, it turned out he had made edits to these embryos, but it was not to the spot that he thought he was editing. So we're not even sure what the health effects are of what he did. And nobody really knows because those children who were eventually born have vanished into a screen of privacy within China. And there are probably a few people who know how well they're doing, but most of us do not, even though we've tried. Um, And it was it was clearly an experiment that was premature as well as unnecessary and resulted in a round of disapproval from across scientists all over the globe with editorials like this, a reckless and needless use of gene editing on human embryos. But, heritable editing is not automatically outside the realm of ethical defensibility. There are certainly concerns. There are people who worry about whether it would be used excessively if it were ever made safe, and it would lead to overuse and so-called designer babies. But do keep in mind that the first step would have to be in vitro fertilization. And as I said earlier, that is not an easy process. It's expensive and unpleasant, and people don't tend to use it unless they really, really have to, because let's face it, conceiving a child through ordinary intercourse is not only less expensive, it's far more pleasurable. So the IVF still poses a kind of gatekeeping role to all of these technologies. The other concern about heritable genome editing is that it may have unknown risks, and certainly we saw with He Jiankui that there are the risks of an off edit or so-called off-target effect, and that conceivably, no pun intended, would be inherited down the generation. So you would have a risk to the immediate child that would be multiplied by the risk to all that child's descendants. Another thing that people worried about was whether it's somehow crossing some kind of boundary, that we shouldn't be so-called playing God. This comes up a lot in the area of human reproduction because, of course, it is an area that is at the core of many of our religious traditions. And so it does tend to overlap strongly with people's views about the appropriate role of humankind in taking control of themselves and their environment. Again, I would simply caution that this notion of playing God is not one that is of a universal understanding. There are some religious traditions that are premised on an activist idea of a deity. That is, um, I can pray for something and ask for something, and there's a deity that's actively listening and might respond, right? And that deity has a role and it's separate from my role. But there are other religions in which either the deity does not respond, it's a much more distant notion. The deity acted in the past and then set the world into motion and then essentially withdraws, or that there's no deity at all, or there's a different notion about the relationship. So when I served on the Bioethics Commission for President Clinton, we were talking about cloning at the time. And we heard from ministers and priests and rabbis and imams to understand kind of religious views. And I was really struck at how the Muslim and Jewish theologians talked about the role of humans as partners in creation and partners in managing the world in a way that was really very different from the way the priests and the ministers talked about it. And I began to see, even within these Western tradition or Abrahamic tradition religions, how different their views of something as fundamental as the role of humans might be. Um, Despite that, there's generally a sense that heritable editing is not a good idea. For some of us, it's because it's not ready for prime time in terms of the science. And for others, it's because there really aren't a lot of situations where you couldn't accomplish what you want, which is having a healthy child, through other techniques like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or adoption or donor sperm or donor eggs. For others, it's because they really are attached to this idea that somehow it is an example of playing God or it's an example of eugenics. Despite that widespread disapproval of heritable editing at this point, there is nonetheless a fair amount of investor interests. And so if you take a look, the investors look at this kind of public polling, which says that a majority of the US says if you were to change a baby's genes to treat a serious disease, it's okay. Um, and they think, well, there's got to be a business model in there. And again, I'm still not convinced that there are enough people who would need to use this technique in order to achieve having a healthy child, to have it make sense as a business model question. But this is where the investor interest seems to be coming. And there are companies that have, in just the last 6 months or so, been announcing that they have formed to try and move the science forward toward making this a reality. One of them, the Manhattan Project, is run by the former wife of Dr. Hu Zhonghui, which I think raises some questions about how far away he is from this project, since he has not proven himself to be reliable when it comes to a commitment to doing the underlying science first. Then there are companies like Bootstrap Bio that was raising seed money. And then just in the last week or two, articles coming out about, again, Silicon Valley investment, in one case at least, with Preventive, uh, populated with scientists that actually have some serious chops behind them. But again, beginning to invest in this. Do they think they're going to increase the market interest in this beyond the very limited market for those who have, for example, no other way to have a genetically related child who would be free of some serious mutation? Where is that expanded market going to lie? How many people are willing to undertake a very risky, complicated area of science in order to try and achieve some unknown improvement? Are they going for enhancements? This is the eugenic worry other people have, but it's a purported benefit of unknown scale and dubious promise against a science that is still incredibly risky. So wait and see whether or not these companies actually manage to survive very long. Biotech companies often come and go very quickly. And one of the other obstacles facing them besides the market is the fact that in the United States, the FDA would not allow the clinical trials to go forward that might actually lead to a safe version of heritable editing. Specifically, the Congress has passed another one of these budgetary measures, like the Dickey-Wicker Amendment. In this case, it prohibits the Food and Drug Administration from even acknowledging that somebody has filed an application to try heritable editing in an actual human being with a pregnancy, right? And it may be confusing. We can talk later about why the FDA has any jurisdiction here, but basically, the edited embryo is considered to be an altered human tissue. And when you alter a tissue sufficiently, it becomes a medical product that is subject to regulation. You might object to the word product being applied to an embryo, but actually, it's not even product. The word is article in the statute, but that's probably far more in the weeds of law than you want. So, where are we with heritable editing in the United States? We have regulations that cover lab work. We have regulations that would cover human subjects in the clinical trials if we ever got there. But if it's done with embryos, it would be absolutely prohibited in some states. And at the federal level, it's impossible because of this FDA limitation on spending its money to accept and review an application to begin. There are other countries that are subject to something called the Oviedo Convention, which is mostly countries within the Council of Europe area. And in those countries, there's an absolute criminal prohibition. But there is the possibility for movement to unregulated jurisdictions, such as international waters, countries without any law at all, or the economic kind of special kind of free of regulation zone like Prospera that was created in Honduras. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. Helixa is a website for a cruise company that is advertising luxury cruises in international waters where they can offer things that would be illegal under the regulatory authorities in any particular country like the US or Canada or one of the European countries. So instead, people can go to a luxury yacht and float out there in the middle of the ocean beyond the jurisdiction of any of these countries in terms of regulation, and then be given so-called treatments that have never been proven, have never been blessed by regulatory authority, and take their chances. Now, is this real? It's still unclear. There is an actual human being who's investing in this. That's been confirmed by a journalist friend of mine. But beyond that, we're not sure how real this is. But the concept is absolutely real. We have a long history of people who want to pursue technological innovations in the therapeutics area that have not been proven and that would not be allowed under current regulations until they've been proven, but who want to make a business out of it. We have a bad history of fraudulent stem cell, quote unquote, therapies, not heritable of any sort, just therapeutic stem cell therapies that were taken offshore in order to induce people to come for everything from trying desperately to treat their cancers or their Alzheimer's to treating their sore backs and their bad knees or their hearts. And we've got some very bad examples of people who've been seriously injured from some of these unproven therapies, including people who've been blinded by them, people who had bone growing out of an eye. But by moving things offshore, or even doing them within the United States, but in a place where the FDA doesn't have the not it has the authority but doesn't have the wherewithal to go ahead and enforce. A lot of these places sprang up, and we had a real problem with fraudulent stem cell clinics. And now the risk is that we're going to see fraudulent gene editing clinics springing up, and here doing it in places like the international waters under Helixa. Um, Now, another thing that's been developing over the years in conjunction alongside all of this are new paradigms of biological parenthood. And I apologize that one of my little cartoons here obscured the parenthood. By the way, for those of you that care, Three Men and a Baby, Trois Hommes et un Couffin, that's the same movie, but the French one came first and it's better. Um, so what does it mean to have parents? And is it always one man and one woman who are the parents? Ever since we started with artificial insemination by anonymous donor in the 1950s, we've had to face the fact that we have a reproductive technology that is deliberately creating situations in which we have a separation between biological parent and social parent. Then we had surrogate motherhood. Again, we had a woman who was giving birth, and she may have been the genetic mother, or she may have been only the gestational mother, having accepted into her body an embryo created by a genetic mother and a sperm donor, or intended rearing father using his own sperm. But we have this kind of mix and match family situation that's developing because of reproductive technologies. Adding to all of this, adding to the fact that we've now separated genetic motherhood from gestational motherhood from rearing motherhood, and separated genetic fatherhood from rearing fatherhood, 5 adults now, we can add in mitochondrial replacement therapy. Because in the cell, in the egg cell, in addition to a nucleus, which has all of the genes that we care about, the stuff that codes for your eyes and your eyelashes, we also have other DNA in the so-called mitochondria. These are little organelles that are crucial for the healthy functioning of the cell. Some people compare it to the batteries of the cell. And there are people who have mutated mitochondrial DNA that causes a variety of diseases. So for them, the answer is, if I want a child who's going to look like me and have my eyes and my eyelashes, but I don't want to pass on my mutated mitochondria, what I want to do is combine the nucleus of my egg with healthy mitochondria from the donor, which would mean taking the cytoplasm. If you can think about like an egg, where the yolk is where the nuclear DNA is located, and the egg white is where the cytoplasm is located that contains the mitochondria. What you want to do is you want to take the egg white from a donor and combine it with my egg yolk and create a new egg, so that I'm genetically related to my child. She has my eyes, she has my eyelashes, but she doesn't have my mutated mitochondria. But now what we've done is we've created a nuclear genetic mother, a mitochondrial genetic mother, a gestational mother, and the rearing mother, and it could be 4 separate women. Plus, of course, you still have the genetic father and the rearing father, so now we're up to 6 people for our family. Again, the mix and match family. And it really is asking us, what do we do about handling the question of who is the parent? Is it just intention? The way we think of adoption, as the adoptive parents are the parents and the only parents, and we make everybody else go away. We make them all invisible, even if we've learned that people often have a very strong interest in learning about their biological parents, no matter how happy they were as adoptees. Is it that we have to make all of these changes in order to recreate what I like to call la famille sauvage, the family in the wild, right? The one mother, one father family. Or should we now be thinking, after all of these technologies have come together, about maybe coming up with a new way of thinking about family in which all these different adults have some acknowledged relationship to the child, but thinking first and foremost about what is in the child's best interest in terms of a stable a stable home life. We've certainly managed it for better or worse when it comes to step families and, post-divorce families and mixed families, whatever the phrase is. So it's not as if we can't imagine a world in which people have multiple parental figures with differing levels of legal authority and legal responsibility. But in the area of reproductive technologies, we've really resisted that idea. And so I only ask, they used to talk about how you could never be, um, you can never be too young or too thin. Well, maybe you can never have too many parents, right? Um, Another thing that is complicating this ever increasing array of people who could have a kind of a familial, even parental relationship is the phenomenon of in vitro gametogenesis, IVG. This is really bizarre. What you do here is you take skin cells, and skin cells are cells that started out as stem cells that can become almost any part of the body, right? And then they have gone through sequential phases of specialization called differentiation. So some stem cells will slowly differentiate toward becoming cells in the blood system, and others, become muscles, and some become skin. If you think about stem cells as being at the base of the trunk of a tree, it's almost like the tree develops branches. There's a blood-related branch, there's a muscle-related branch, and then beyond that, you have twigs, and the twigs get more and more fine-tuned. So the skin cells are way up there in the level of
Dr.
twigs, I
Charo,
mean.
we did
Yes,
have a question of clarification. I wondered if you could just help us with.
please.
Caleb asked in the chat if you could give us some more detail on what you meant by having multiple parents for one embryo. This was the mitochondrial and all the other variants.
So let me go back a slide here. It's not going to really help, actually. Terrible slide. Sorry. If you think about it, ordinarily, if you have conception through intercourse and a woman gets pregnant, then the egg that was used to conceive that child came from her body. It represents her own nuclear DNA and her mitochondrial DNA because it's a single cell with a nucleus and cytoplasm, hasn't been separated. Nobody's done anything to it. So she is both the nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA mother. She's the genetic mother in both nuclear and mitochondrial respects. And because the egg was fertilized inside her body and she maintains the pregnancy, she is also the gestational mother. And assuming that she is going to rear that child, once it's born, she is the rearing mother. So she is four kinds of mothers, right? Nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA, gestation, and rearing. She's four different kinds of mothers. And as far as the man goes, if a man is conceiving through natural intercourse, it means he's using his own sperm. And if he's going to also rear that child, that means that he is both the genetic father and the rearing father. So we now have 6 relationships, right? Nuclear DNA mother, mitochondrial DNA mother, gestational mother, rearing mother, genetic father, right? Or sperm genetic father, and then rearing father. 6 relationships. That's what I meant by talking about the variety of people. When they talk about 3-parent IVF, what they're saying is that you now have a gestational mother and a nuclear DNA mother and a mitochondrial DNA mother, and they can all be 3 different women. And then if you add a 4th woman who takes care of it, who's going to take the baby home because she wasn't any of those 3 women, that's 4 women. Is this helping? Jonathan, you want to quickly check if that helped?
I think so. I think that clarifies for me. Caleb, does that sound okay to you? I think so, Dr. Charo. Keep
Okay.
going. I'll tell you if there's another.
All right.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I
yes.
know.
Sorry, thank you.
I know
Okay,
that
yeah.
I know I speak incredibly fast. I'm from New York, and it's a habit I've never been able to get over. I think also because I was the youngest in the family, and if you didn't speak fast, everybody spoke over you. So in vitro gametogenesis, back to the stem cells. So as I was saying, if you think about stem cells as the base of the tree, and then the branches, and then the twigs, and the skin cell is kind of like a twig, what we have learned is that you can move that specialization process backwards in time. you can take it from twig to branch to trunk to root. In this case, you can take a cell that's already specialized all the way to being a special kind of skin cell and make it less and less and less specialized. That's de-differentiation. That's kind of amazing. And then you can then re-specialize it, but in a different direction. So imagine you're going down from one twig down a branch on the eastern side of the tree to the trunk, and now you're going to re-specialize it up the western side of the tree to an entirely different path and twig. And in this case, it's taking a skin cell, de-differentiating it into what's called induced pluripotent stem cell state. It just means it's a lot less specialized. And then re-specialize it into either eggs or sperm. So now what you've done is you've taken a skin cell and you've transformed it into an egg, or you've transformed it into sperm. If you do that successfully, and that is still an area of active research, and there are some very big biological obstacles to doing it in a way that is healthy, but assuming you could ever do it, those recreated eggs and sperm could be used with IVF to create a human embryo that could lead to a baby. So now what you've done is you've taken skin cells and turned them into babies, which for many people seems pretty wild. But think about what else this means. These two figures here, these could be two men, they could be two women, and you could be using this technique to try and, particularly for two men, it's easier than for two women because you need, for two women, you wouldn't have the Y chromosome that you need to make sperm. But for two men, right? Each man gives a cell, and then they use one of those cells to recreate an egg with two X chromosomes, and then another one, they create sperm with an X and a Y, and they use IVF, and suddenly you've got a baby that is the genetic offspring of two men. Never before done. Like I said, there are some problems, and for those that are interested in the biology of this, the problems are really having to do with epigenetics and imprinting, and we can pick that up later if you like. But those are crucial, crucial things in normal human development that are still under active research. That said, there are still companies that are trying to work on this. So Conception is one, which is describing here the process here, starting with iPS cells. Those would be the de-differentiated skin cells, turning them into primordial germ cells, turning that into the kind of precursors of gametes, and then into here, maturing it into an egg. That was their business. That was the scientific explanation for their business model. Then Next Gen Fertility also working on this. There are other companies in this space as well. And again, what is their market? One of their markets that they see is, in fact, single-sex couples that would like to have children that are genetically related to both of them. They also potentially see a market in people who can't use their own eggs or sperm for some reason. Maybe they've got some fertility obstacle. Maybe they were sterilized during a chemotherapy that they had to undergo when they were younger. And this is a way for them to create gametes that they otherwise wouldn't have. So this is where they see their market. And like I said, there are some real scientific problems with this, but there's a lot of work, particularly from Dr. Hayashi at Osaka University in Japan. And he has been more successful than anybody in being able to use gene editing to try and correct some of the problems that occur when you try to de-differentiate and re-differentiate. And so he has now managed to get what looks to be healthy mice, embryonic cells with DNA from two male mice, and survived until adulthood when he used those to fertilize. Now, we have seen many things that work fine in mice and don't work in humans, but this is further along than I think most of us had predicted just a couple of years ago. And so for that reason, the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine did have a workshop on the concept of in vitro derived human gametes, or IVG. And when we did this workshop, we realized that honestly, it's a little unclear how the federal laws would work on this. Remember I said Dickie Wicker prevents the federal government from funding research that creates, destroys, or seriously injures embryos? Would that prevent the federal government from funding this work? And this is not a trivial question because even if you don't get a federal grant specifically to do your work, if you're at an institution that gets federal grants generally, a lot of those grants include an extra sum of money called overhead or indirects that go to finance the entire institution, keeps the lights on, hires the janitorial staff, hires the institutional review board that will review research protocols. So if your work is not eligible for federal funding, you may not be able to do that work even with private money if it takes place at an institution that is collecting federal money for other things. It's why some of the work on embryonic stem cells that did involve embryo destruction at the University of Wisconsin had to be moved entirely off campus into a separate building that was entirely privately financed, totally separate from the university, because no way could the embryonic stem cell work benefit from these indirect monies that were going to the campus. So it's a real question about whether Dickey Wicker covers this, and yet Dickey Wicker only talks about embryos that are at risk or being destroyed. But here, IVG is not doing that. It's creating embryos, but it's not destroying them. So it's really unclear whether the federal restrictions would apply. And as far as the FDA goes, the FDA is not allowed to accept a clinical trial application when the embryo is intentionally modified to create a heritable genetic modification. But here it's unclear how you define genetic modification. Now, Peter Marks, who used to be the head of the Center for Biologics at the FDA, said during the workshop that despite the ambiguity of the language in these various federal provisions, probably this IVG work would not be eligible for federal money and probably would have trouble getting through the FDA. Again, indicating why there is a business model confronting these companies. And yet, despite that, these companies are moving forward. Whether they do it here or someplace offshore, that's an open question. And the research is going on to try and at least prove the underlying safety of it. Here, the Japanese are moving forward with embryo creation using these kinds of cells. Now, none of this is going to matter unless you actually can make a baby, right? It's one thing to make an embryo, however you're going to make it, but until you make a baby, not as much of a big deal. So, one of the things that's really become of interest is the so-called artificial womb. Now it's not being developed for these guys. It's being developed because we have a problem of preterm babies. Premature birth is associated with a whole host of very serious disorders. And the rate of preterm birth is very high in the United States, up to like 15% for some subgroups and 10% for others. So overall, we have a very high rate of premature birth in the United States. And like I said, it's associated with a variety of medical problems that can result in lifetime of disability and a lot of medical costs, and certainly a lot of anxiety. So current standard of care for premature infants is basically to try and keep the pregnancy going as long as possible, and then you put the kid, the newborn, however young, into a neonatal intensive care unit with a kind of bassinet that has a variety of tools to try to support continued development when the body is not quite ready, particularly things like the lungs are not ready. But they have lots and lots of side effects. And even the care that we give can actually introduce new problems. Some people in my age bracket are blind because of the efforts when they were premature newborns to give them the oxygen they needed because their lungs weren't developed, but turns out that there was oxygen toxicity that actually caused blindness. And it's just one example of how inadequate our neonatal intensive care units are. As much as they've made progress, they are still quite inadequate. And it costs a fortune, especially the younger that they are at birth, the more that it costs and the poorer the outcomes. And so there's been a lot of interest in artificial wombs. Instead of a neonatal intensive care unit, could you actually create an artificial womb? So if the woman delivers prematurely because her body just expels the fetus, can you transfer it into what is a mechanical equivalent of a womb? And here are some examples of what we're talking about, something that looks pretty awful here. This is actually a sheep. And this was an example from several years ago of successfully managing to maintain the fetus in normal development for a couple of weeks in this kind of womb-like environment. But The womb is a very complicated area. It's got all kinds of biological controls having to do with the nutrients that are passing through the placenta, the temperature control, the hormonal influences, a whole variety of things. And trying to replicate all of that, not at all easy, but very much the subject of a lot of research going on. So is it really possible? What you have to do is you have to get oxygen and nutrients through an artificial placenta. You've got to remove waste products. Um, and you've got to incorporate sensors that will monitor all the vital signs. And so we are now at the FDA. I'm not at the FDA anymore, but the FDA is currently looking at the comparison between the current standard of care versus artificial womb technology. Now, this is all very high risk, and ordinarily high risk stuff takes a long time to get approved, but given the urgency of it, right? That is, every day that goes by is another premature kid who's being cared for in one of these inadequate neonatal intensive care units. There's a lot of pressure to try and see if the artificial womb technology could be better, at least for some conditions. So is this a reproductive future or a nightmare? Because, of course, the next step that people imagine is not just handling the last few weeks of pregnancy for premature infants, but could you have an entire pregnancy from conception all the way to birth in an artificial womb? Now, this, by the way, is incredibly distant in the future, if ever, this true test tube baby concept. But it is certainly something people are already talking about, so-called ectogenesis. And if you imagine, it means that you would imagine this whole thing being put together. We wouldn't even start with eggs or sperm. We wouldn't even start with that step of IVF. We would start with my skin cells and your skin cells. And together we would dedifferentiate them and we'd make eggs and sperm. And then we would create an embryo in a petri dish, which we would then develop and put into an artificial womb and grow it all the way 9 months, assuming we still need 9 months, and give birth. Is that the future? And if it is that something to look forward to, or is that something that you consider to be a nightmare? Whoops, sorry, I hit the wrong thing there. By the way, as if that wasn't bizarre enough, this was from August 21st, 2025, and it was an article about China developing the first ever pregnancy robots. Now, again, they are talking about something that could be handling essentially an artificial womb for the last couple of weeks of pregnancy following a premature delivery. But when you added that in, now we have something that is really looking like it's coming out of Hollywood. So let's put it all together. Amazingly, there are a lot of companies in this space. There's a lot of money in this space. And I'm going to tell you again and again, because I'm repeating myself, I don't see the business model for a lot of these things. The artificial womb, yes, because there are a lot of premature infants, but beyond that, no. And then for a lot of these other things, the embryo editing, don't really need it. You can use embryo diagnosis and embryo selection instead. The IVG, maybe, but I think that some of the biological challenges, even if Dr. Hayashi is successful with his mice, are still very, very substantial. But nonetheless, we can see that the money is coming in to a variety of startup companies, and it is the collective work of all of these things together, the in vitro gametogenesis, then the diagnostics on the embryo, the editing for those that can be corrected, and then the artificial womb that would really lead to this kind of future that people are talking about, not in my lifetime, maybe in yours. I want to conclude, however, with something that I call the good news. And that is that there's another technology that doesn't have some of these problems, but is struggling to gain anybody's attention, which is why I'm going to make a point of talking to you about it. And that is fetal therapy. Super expensive, which is why I called it $1 Million Baby, but really, really promising. You know, there are a number of disorders we can detect during pregnancy. You can tell already that the fetus has a problem. And for years, there have been therapies. One is surgery, for example, to correct a heart defect. Then there's blood transfusions. The most recent is an effort to actually do gene therapy of one sort or another in the fetus before it's born. Now, I want to make sure that you understand this is not about heritable editing, because this is not about changing sperm or eggs or the developing gametes in the fetus. This is about a fetus that's probably second trimester, third trimester, and is already exhibiting a disorder, which is causing problems in the body even before birth. So if you could correct the problem before birth, you can correct the problem before it has a chance to take a toll on the body of this future baby. And some of these slides that I'm about to show you are courtesy of Tippy McKenzie, who's an incredibly talented surgeon researcher at UCSF. So why would you want to do this kind of fetal therapy? Well, first, if you want to do gene therapy for an already born child or an adult, you have to deliver the gene into the body, and that delivery system has turned out to be a challenge. The most common thing to do is to deliver it using essentially a denatured virus. And the adenovirus is the one of choice because it's the one that we all know about. It's the one that gives us colds every winter. So it's really good at penetrating our bodies. The trouble is that once we've been exposed to a particular virus, we develop an immune reaction. And so if you try to deliver a gene for gene therapy to the body using a viral vector, you may find that you can't give a second or third dose in the future because the body's developed an immune response to it. Well, fetuses don't have a mature immune system. So they are wired for tolerance. Their bodies don't resist the virus, and it doesn't develop an immune reaction to it that prevents redosing. The second is that sometimes there are parts of the body that are much more accessible during fetal development than they are even just after birth. So, for example, there are hematopoietic, that's the blood system, the hematopoietic stem cells that are more accessible in the fetus because they're in the liver and they haven't yet kind of moved into the bone marrow where they're much less accessible. Or for the lungs, for cystic fibrosis, a very common genetic disorder, the lungs have all these kind of like little pathways, little interstices, very hard to get the genes into the cells back there. But when the fetus is still floating in amniotic fluid, much easier to deliver. In addition, the blood-brain barrier prevents us from accessing the brain with a lot of drugs that we might want to use to try to treat brain disorders. But again, in the fetus, that blood-brain barrier is much more permeable. And so we might be able to do gene therapies for neurological diseases at the fetal stage, but never be able to do them after the child is born. And then finally, the fetus is small. I mean, fetuses are tiny. Some of the pictures that you see in the propaganda, pro and con abortion tends to mispresent with the size of a fetus. But for most of its developmental stages, it's teeny. And that means that you don't need as high a dose of the vectors that are used to deliver genes. And that vector is often a very expensive part of the whole therapy. So there can be some very big advantages, both medical and economic, in trying to treat before a child is born. And this won't work for every disease, and not every disease is better treated before birth because not every disease does its damage before birth. But for some, this is really a major advance. It's also incredibly complicated from a regulatory point of view and complicated in terms of cost because it's really a very much bespoke, one-off kind of thing. And so it is going to be a challenge to make this realistically available, right? But it is something that is a third path that is kind of wedged between heritable editing and somatic editing. And so for some disorders, it really could be more efficient and effective. But we have to get past the first in human studies. We have to get past the challenges of long-term surveillance to make sure that we're getting the effect that we want. And the regulatory complexities regarding risk and parental consent, which if it involves pregnancy is always going to be more complicated. Abortion is not available in all parts of the country now at these stages of pregnancy, and yet you need to have that as a backup in case things go badly. And you don't want to risk creating a situation where a child is born even worse off than otherwise and suffering. And of course, again, the absence of a strong business model. So again, it's, I think, good news, but not good news that does not have challenges. So let me end by saying that there are two competing visions of the future. And one is certainly the end of sex. This is my colleague at Stanford, Hank Greeley, the end of sex. But then, of course, our old favorite from Aldous Huxley about Brave New World, and then a variety of other books. So they tend to be the doomsayers who really view this as the invitation to commodifying people or to losing our emotional connection to human reproduction, and to beginning to think of children as products. I have to say, the kind of fears that people have been raising ever since artificial insemination came on the scene in the 1950s, but it's a real fear. On the other hand, as a Star Trek fan, I need to point out that even in the far future, as imagined by Star Trek, you have a very emotionally complex, a very, if I may say, human aspect to reproduction, even when it involves aliens and humans, even when it just involves aliens, even when it involves hybrids of human Klingon combinations with a doctor who's a hologram, and even when the birth takes place by coming out of somebody's back instead of their front, or even when it's an android that has an android daughter who has inherited his neural net. A much more positive view of human reproduction, even with the introduction of technology. So with that, I'd like to say "kakko," which is Klingon for thank you for paying attention, and I'm happy to move it into Q&A. Thank you.
Dr. Charo, thank you so much. You have stimulated a mountain, a bevy of questions, and I've tried to organize those for you. So what I'd like to do, friends, in the Q&A is sort of give you a chance to ask your questions. But Dr. Charo, I'll let you choose. I've divided these up. We've got a few clarificatory questions which we can touch on early on, and then I've broken them up, as you might expect, by meta-ethical questions and then questions around non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and just one question of autonomy.
Okay.
So if it's okay, we'll start maybe just briefly with the clarificatory questions and go from there. So Corbin, if you're still here, do you want to ask your question about really a technical scientific question? And if not, I can ask on your behalf.
Maybe you should ask on his behalf.
Yeah. So Corbin had a question that I will muddle my way through here. He just wanted to know, with in vitro gametogenesis, he's asking if you've got two female undifferentiated cells converted to gametes,
Right.
that wouldn't be able to create a male zygote, he says, but
Right.
would it be possible to create a female zygote?
Yes, but again, the problem is going to be, so first of all, he's correct that the problem here is creating a Y chromosome because the egg doesn't
It's
have
right.
one, right?
Right. Yep.
Although there's work on how to transform an X chromosome into a Y chromosome, right?
Okay.
So between embryo editing and other manipulations, that is work. But yes, it's easier to create an egg. So the problem really is with the phenomenon of epigenetics and imprinting. We don't really understand yet all the ways in which genes are regulated. But we do know that epigenetics helps us understand how strongly genes will be expressed. I sometimes compare it to the pedals on a piano, affecting how loudly or softly the chord gets played. If you think of the chord as the gene, it's literally something that wraps around the gene. Imprinting is even more poorly understood, but we also seem to have learned that interestingly, there are some things that seem to travel through the paternal line and others through the maternal line. And if that gets disrupted, there's a small number of very, fairly rare diseases that are caused by this imprinting problem. I'm not going to try to explain imprinting to you, but to suffice it to say that that is one of the reasons why parthenogenesis has never been successful, right? Because the absence of a paternal line meant that you got abnormal imprinting. Even though you had all the requisite number of of chromosomes, right? You were missing something that had to do with the imprinting, which is related, as I understand it, to epigenetics. But beyond that, I'm not really sure how to explain.
That's fair. No, Corbin says he's having problems with his microphone, but thank you for answering the question. The last clarification question came from Jackie, and Jackie, if you're here, yeah, you're here. If you want to ask your question, you can, or I can ask it on your behalf.
All right, thank you. It's my impression that the majority of premature deliveries are due to too many embryos put into the uterus in the first place after IVF, or sometimes the woman having a C-section, which she thinks she's further along in the pregnancy than she is, and so it ends up premature. So it seems like there's a lot of preventable prematurity. And how do we get the system to spend more money and regulation on that rather than creating an artificial womb? Well, not to say that that isn't also important,
Right,
but
right.
it seems to me that there are less technically difficult but more impactful things we can do right now.
So I would only quibble with what you said at the very beginning, which is that most premature births are due to these things. I don't know that that is true. It is certainly true that historically, when IVF was under development, there was a tendency to put back many embryos, and it did result, predictably, in twins, trips, quads. And as soon as you have too many fetuses crowding the uterus, you increase the chance of premature delivery tremendously. Um, that is not the case anymore. It is now typical to put back at most two, and usually only one, because techniques have improved to the point where the balance of risks associated with either not getting a successful pregnancy versus getting one that's too successful in a sense, leaned toward putting back only one. On the C-sections, I know that they are far more common than they are in many other countries. We have far more C-sections in the United States than in other places. I don't know that that is associated with premature births that much, but I'll leave that to you. It might be that you've got better data on that. But a lot of prematurity is due to other factors. It could be nutritional, it could be occupational, general health of the mother, um, and age of pregnancy as well, and the kind of the body's ability to sustain the pregnancy. So there's a lot of different causes, and um, without question, you don't want to look for a techno fix to a problem that has an easier fix in terms of supporting people's health before and during pregnancy. Um, but I don't know that just working on IVF and C-sections would get you where you want to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll jump, I think, with your permission, Dr. Charo, to questions about justice, because we've had a slew of these and they're coming from a variety of people. And I'll start with a comment from David, who said in the chat, and I appreciated this, surely you don't need a good business case, you just need a few billionaires. Now, that's not a question per se, but you might want to respond to it, perhaps.
No, I think it's actually quite fair. And I just had an interesting conversation just last week with somebody who is highly critical of these technologies in general.
Okay.
And I was saying to him, there's no business model. I don't know, why would anybody invest their money? Should I be really worried if there's no business model? Because without a business model, it's never going to expand to the point where it's really a big deal, right? So a
Yeah.
couple of lunatics will try something, and he said, do you think they're doing it to make money, or do you think they're doing it because they just think they can do it? Or do you think they're doing it because it's going to bring attention to them? Or do you think they're doing it because it's going to lead to the development of adjacent technologies that may actually be worth money in
Yeah.
laboratory processes or some other kind of piece of equipment they had to develop that itself will make money, and this will be the throwaway, right? And I had to sit back and
Yeah.
say, well, that's a good question. I don't, he hasn't been able to name one of those things, but it's a good question.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think there are a handful of people who do seem to be interested in pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable simply for the sake of pushing those boundaries. And I think they are some of the same people that you're talking about and that are investing in places like Prospera in Honduras, which is kind of like an anarchist's dream of non-regulatory, non-governmental control opportunities for medical therapies.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds like the start of a delicious science fiction or horror movie. Um, Caleb had a question for you, and Caleb, I'm gonna read. You've had several questions, so I'm gonna read this one, Caleb, and then you can jump in and clarify if you'd like to. But you said in this same vein, Dr. Charo, it's great that these companies have had to be able to develop these tests and tech to help. However, what are we doing? What can we be doing to make these affordable to Americans, not just those who can afford it? Can we even hope that with the current state of healthcare system in the U.S.?
So I want to turn in this case to something that's not reproductive, but it is about genetics, and that's gene therapy, somatic gene therapy, in particular gene editing therapies. You may have seen the great announcement recently about a bespoke therapy for a kid who had this terrible liver disease that created ammonia overloads and was going to kill him. And within a few months, the gene mutation was identified, an edit was identified, a vector was identified. The FDA collaborated with a company and with researchers to develop a delivery method, and he was treated, and now he's doing well. Baby KJ, this out of the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
In addition, we also have companies like Vertex, and here I should mention that I did consult very briefly for Vertex, which developed the first FDA-approved gene editing therapy for sickle cell anemia, which gives you a one-time treatment that cures you, as opposed to a lifetime of multiple trips to the hospital, miserable, painful sickle cell crises, a shortened lifespan, and a challenging existence. How do we make these things affordable, whether it's for something like sickle cell, which is relatively common, or it is something like the bespoke therapy? The answer is going to lie in a combination of things. It can be done, but it will not be easy. First, there are technical innovations that would make these things less expensive. For the sickle cell trial, it required that we do the editing, what's called ex vivo. You had to remove cells from the bone marrow and then bring them to a laboratory, do gene editing on them, and return them to the bone marrow. And by the way, the bone marrow had to first be conditioned by something that's effectively a chemotherapy. So the patient had to be in the hospital for over a month, and that's incredibly expensive, and many people can't afford to be away from their families or work for a month. And then you had to do this whole work outside in a laboratory. There's transportation costs and facility costs, and then it gets transplanted back. One way to dramatically reduce the cost would be to develop a so-called in vivo kind of thing, in which all you do is you squirt the magic stuff into the body and it travels to the organ of interest and only targets the cells there. This is most likely going to be possible first with liver-based diseases because there are delivery vectors like lipid nanoparticles that will preferentially head to the liver. But that would be one start, is technical. A second is in the manufacturing facilities themselves, to have a decentralized manufacturing system so you don't have to deal with transportation costs, which turn out to be substantial. A third is in the regulatory pathway. Instead of having to approve each specific gene change and its vector, can you have, and the FDA has now announced that it's going to do this, a generic approval of various platform technology. So you may have 25 liver-based genetic disorders. If there's a single platform that can be used to house varying targets that would handle all 25 of those different genetic mutations, and a single vector that's been approved, then you've now basically created a modular regulatory approval system. So the only thing that needs to be checked is the specific target and target correction that you're proposing, but all of the other machinery is already approved. And that speeds up and simplifies the regulatory path, and regulatory processes are very time consuming, and time is money. So all of these things together, but then at the end of the day, the bigger problem is going to be also in the pricing system. If you have a one and done therapy, then all of the money that was spent to investigate a disease and to develop a therapy, all of that incredible amount of money it takes to do that has to earn its profit off of a single treatment for often a very small population of people. It's not like 75 million of us who take statins every day for 15 or 20 years of our lives to handle our cholesterol levels, which means if they make a quarter of a penny on each pill, the companies are still making a lot of money, and they're making back all of their investment on this drug, the investment on the 9 drugs that didn't work, because most things don't work, and that's lost money, and a profit to support investment in the next drug and their shareholders.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut in right there, but when you talk about like the companies trying to, I guess in a sense, justify the amount of money that goes into research and developing these things, do you think that it's ethical to then make it something that is a long-term treatment, or to justify that as the reason why these treatments or these technologies are developed as instead of a one-time, one-stop like treatment, and instead make it something that instead does become a timely, costly type of treatment that many Americans won't be able to afford.
No, I'm not suggesting that companies ought to somehow manipulate this so that they can make more money out of it. I'm simply pointing out that with a one-time payment to charge people, right? Unless the charge is incredibly high, they're never going to make back their money. And then if they can't make back their money, they're not going to invest. That's just reality. So there have been several proposals for ways to actually make it profitable for these companies without a high upfront cost. Some of these therapies are coming out at like $3 to $4 million for the therapy because it's one time. It's still cheaper over the lifetime of the patient to have a one-time therapy at $4 million, but most people and most insurance companies can't handle that cost right up front. So there have been proposals to stretch the payments out the way we do for mortgages on houses. There have been other proposals to have the companies get paid only on a periodic basis as the therapy is proving itself successful. If the therapy, in fact, over time fails, if its effect wears off, the payments would wear off, right? There's been proposals for what is essentially a reinsurance system, right? A reinsurance pool. So all the companies basically subscribe the way we do to Netflix. I pay a certain amount whether I watch one movie or 25 movies that month, but I'm eligible to watch all 25. So companies can all buy into a pool and they can get access to whatever therapy they need for their particular insured, even if it turns out this year they only needed one and the next year they need 25. So there's been a lot of work at matching a system of financial incentives to the company's needs at the same time trying to find something that's more affordable. I can see Caleb has just turned his video back on.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question at all?
Yes, it did, and it actually leads me into my next one, which Professor Bieber, I think, if with your blessing from the chat, I wanted to lead into, since you were mentioning how the FDA doesn't exactly, I guess in some cases, really approve funding for these types of programs or research programs, is there then any sort of third-party ethics committee or organization already in place or being put in place to be able to at least, I mean, especially with the ever-growing distrust in large government systems, including our own, is there any sort of committee or organization in place to make sure that these research topics and technologies are being created and tested and developed in a ethical way, especially since you talk about the concern about population control, eugenics, things like that?
Well,
Dr. Charo, I thought this could be a good spot to talk about the role of consultants in these spaces too.
So there's a couple of things that kind of got conflated there. You talked about the FDA funding. The FDA doesn't fund anything. Funding comes primarily from the National Institutes of Health to fund basic science research. The FDA regulates products, but I wasn't sure if maybe you were talking about whether the FDA has any role in regulating the pricing of products. That's different from funding the research. And the answer is they don't have a role in either of those. So that's the short answer. The FDA only looks at safety and efficacy. That's their job. Their statute does not allow them to look at other things, including, by the way, some of these more morality-based things that you might think should be part of what they do. So they are carefully limited by their statute. When it comes to the kind of the ethics of research generally, yes, there are multiple sources of oversight at different levels. So first, the NIH itself can make judgments about what they want to fund that reflects public health needs, consumer interest, patient advocacy. A particular member of Congress may have a bug up his, whatever, and, push for funding in something. So there are a lot of political and non-political influences, as well as a whole slew of different kinds of advisory committees that contribute to the creation of the kind of prioritization in terms of research. Then in terms of how the research is deployed once it's been developed, right? At the level of societal disruption, right? Again, federal government has very limited authority under our constitutional system to say this application should be prohibited because we think that it's immoral. But there's a lot of authority at the state level to do exactly that. So you do have some states that can say, we won't let anybody do research on embryos. The federal government may say we can't use that, you can't use federal money for that research, but a state can actually say you can't do the research within our borders at all. So there's a disconnect between federal authority and state authority. Then there's, of course, a whole variety of oversight mechanisms for how research is done on animals as well as on humans. And it happens at both the federal level and also at the level of individual institutions through these institutional review boards and the animal care committees that oversee that kind of research. So there's that. But in terms of should some things be done at all, and at the end of the day, in many cases, it's political. People can vote. They can have a referendum that says we think certain things shouldn't be allowed. And that's exactly what the European countries have largely done with things like heritable editing. Whether you agree or not, they've said, we don't want this. And through democratic mechanisms, they've decided that they will not have them. They will not allow it. In the United States, we haven't done that on genome editing, partly because we don't need to, since the FDA has effectively made it impossible. But when cloning came around in the 1990s, that's exactly what happened in a handful of states which passed laws that said you cannot do human cloning. Now, some of them passed laws with really, really ambiguous definitions, and they wound up banning certain laboratory research as well as banning the creation of babies, which may or not have been their intent, but it happened at the state level, not at the federal level.
Yeah, it's a complex landscape for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Turning back to questions of justice, we have a question from Gretchen about responses to heritable genome editing. Gretchen, you want to go ahead?
Hi, Dr. Charo. Thank you so much. I had a question regarding the heritable genome editing and disability activism. So you mentioned that there were some major concerns for the editing having implications of ableism. And I'm wondering what kind of advocacy or activism you've actually noticed. So I understand the ethical implications, but how does that activism make itself manifest in your work? And what impacts have you noticed from their activism?
Well, I'd say that it's primarily coming from two communities. One is the community of people who have some kind of deafness, and the other for people of short stature, dwarfism, midgets, or as they call themselves, little people. And it's primarily from these two groups because these are groups of people who have found themselves feeling like they are more of a community of people who simply are speaking a different language, for example, in the case of people who are deaf using ASL, rather than feeling themselves disabled. To the extent that they are disadvantaged, they see it mostly as a disadvantage that is socially created because the structures around us are built around an assumption that everybody can use ears for hearing, right? Or that everybody is of a certain height and can reach certain things. If the world were constructed differently, then they would not be disadvantaged, which is different from people who have a serious disease that is not made miserable because of the structure of the world around them, but because their bodies are just falling apart. I'd say that the community of people with a variety of the varieties of autism, ranging from mild to severe, are also now entering this space of discussion as well. Because you see now for the milder forms, discussion around simply kind of human variation as opposed to it being a disease. Whereas severe autism, people who are non-communicative and unable to actually, exist in the world at all, really would still consider themselves totally disabled, or others would. How does that manifest itself? For one thing, having served on a seemingly endless series of committees for the National Academy of Sciences, for various government advisory committees, for professional society committees, one thing that's happened over the years has been the steady increase in insistence in the inclusion of people with disabilities or representatives of disability communities in these committees to speak to exactly this issue.
That's
So
great.
that there's not an assumption that everything that is not, quote, normal, and that word is now already kind of, verboten, needs to be corrected, as opposed to needs to be accepted as part of the human variation. The second is that it has led to very lively discussions about the role of parents vis-a-vis children. When you think about it, for example, in the deaf community, where there's an option for cochlear implants early on to give deaf children some ability to hear noise. Active discussions about whether parents should be obligated to provide that versus it's a choice about whether to provide it, is something that came out of discussions with the disabled community. Because originally the sense was, of course, you have to give it to your kid, right? It would be like not giving your kid an antibiotic if they have an infection, right? Deafness is like a disease and it has to be cured with the cochlear implant. That's not the way people talk anymore. Now it's considered a choice. And there's just been some advances in genome editing to correct certain forms of heritable deafness, which is going to raise that kind of question all over again. The third is something that dates back really to the 1970s with the Rehabilitation Act, and then more recently under George W. Bush, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that is the requirement that in some very fundamental ways, we recreate the world so that it doesn't, in fact, disadvantage so many people. This is why we have curb cuts. I mean, many of you in the audience are too young to remember curb cuts are a new thing. Escalators in the subways and elevators in the subways, new thing. Having somebody constantly doing sign language translation, a new thing. These were all the result of the forcing effect of the Americans with Disabilities Act that required that we retrofit the world so that more people could actually participate in it. And it was helped by the fact that slowly people began to realize that almost all of us at some point in our lives or another are going to need these same accommodations, right? As you get older, just stepping up from a curb is hard. And it's really nice that there's a slanted place that you can just walk up. Or you get an illness. I had an inner ear infection a few years ago that left me completely deaf for about 2 months. And it was amazing how many things were there to accommodate me and how many things were not, and how isolating it was still to be deaf. So I'd see the activism has been the form of the activism has been organization within the disability community, participation in advisory committees of all sorts that exist at every level of government and in policymaking, legal mechanisms that are technology forcing, and they cost money. I mean, school districts have to make a choice about how they'll spend their money, and they may not be able to offer one thing to a lot of kids because they've got to accommodate by changing the building so that a smaller number of kids can now participate. These are choices. But all of these are ways in which this has manifested itself.
Thank you so much for answering my question.
You're
I
welcome.
do want to extend it just a bit because you've provided me so much to work with. And this might be a little more complicated, but I'd like to extend it towards non-heritable disability. So my concerns are how a person who didn't inherit their disability, who had it, inflicted upon them for in one way or another, disease,
Sure.
injury, how they would represent themselves or what their perceptions are in this form of activism, because there is a sense of or a feeling of injustice that may occur from not being able to reconcile their disability the same way you would for like a genetic technology. So, I mean, do you have any insight into that?
I think that probably goes beyond my expertise because that really goes to kind of the psychological phenomenon. I can say that I've because I've now got friends who have various disabilities, and as I said, I briefly had a very significant one myself. And also genetically, I do actually have an optical problem. It's not that obvious to you, but so I guess I can speak from both sides. There's a period of time of adjustment. People who've had traumatic injuries, like the people who've had a sudden case of paralysis after an accident, go through a very, very, very dramatic period of adjustment. Some people never adjust, others do. It seems like there's a moment for some people where they stop trying to live despite the absence of something and just start trying to live with what they have, and that switches something. But how that affects their interest and willingness to participate in the disabled rights movement or the activist community, I really can't speak to. I apologize.
No, I maybe I wasn't specific enough. I'm trying, and I also accept that there might not be an answer to this question, but I'm really more interested in how that community would care about this technology. So there is a disparity, right, that we both agree on, but I'm not so concerned about how they feel a sense of injustice, but maybe and I feel like this question is very complicated, but how they might perceive um, human genetic or genome editing
Right.
as representative of something good, right? Like a good thing,
Right.
or they're totally against it, and if they are also involved in those committee hearings that you
Yeah.
were discussing.
Well, people whose disabilities come from both non-heritable and heritable origins participate, both.
Hmm.
Um, there are some people I've heard in these meetings who worry that with the ability to prevent the birth of children who have certain kinds of problems, let's say spina bifida, because spina bifida causes a form of paralysis or reduced mobility that would have an analog in traumatic injuries after birth that are non-heritable, right? So both populations might need special accommodations having to do with mobility limitations. And so I've heard people complain that if we focus on trying to prevent the birth of children with these conditions, it's going to reduce the number of people with them to the point where the societal tolerance for investing money to make a world that accommodates this is going to go away, and they will be once again isolated. And yet, at the same time, you have an equal number of people say, I wouldn't wish this problem on somebody. I would not, even with all the accommodations in the world, it'd be better to be more mobile than not. So why would I wish that people be born with a mobility problem just to ensure a large enough population of people with mobility problems to be a political force? So you
Hmm.
hear both attitudes. Um, and I hear both attitudes from both sides of this community, whether it's post-birth or pre-birth kinds of concerns. So
You
I
did
wish
a great job. Thank you for, I know I pushed it a little bit, but thank you so
yeah.
much, Dr. Charo.
We have one question. Maybe we'll conclude with a question from Dr. Kubler about ethics frameworks.
Okay, I'll try. See if I can get my video back on and rejoin the group. Um, I heard you speaking largely about the history and the legal frameworks, which was extremely informative. And I did not hear you take sides in any way, which, makes perfect sense. It felt very careful and very measured to not discuss emerging technologies and maybe changes in social opinion or policy toward what is enabled by these technologies. You didn't come down on one side or the other. Um, but my thoughts are going toward what do we do about it? I probably can't come up with a good example, but I'm sure you could of where there was something that was thought impossible, and then a technology comes along and it's now possible, but initially thought Frankensteinian, and then gained acceptance. And so, we might take a look at these things and these new technologies and say, well, it would just take time for us to accept all these multiple parents, for a child, or enabling, certain genetic mutations. Others might say, absolutely not. It violates sanctity and is impure. Still others may say, well, that's just your cultural mores and your reference. Um, so my mind is I guess, confused as to how to think about these things. At the same time, we look toward ethicists to tell us how to decide in an institutional review board what research should be done. And there's some guiding principles that are maybe thought of as almost universal or approving universality, like beneficence as such. So, in your travels, can you find or identify any frameworks that you found potentially helpful, or maybe with some ethical universality that would even transcend cultural barriers and religious mores and structures, and could serve as a framework for saying certain technologies bad, others good, but it may take time to accept them? I don't know if my question makes sense.
No, I think it's the question that we all struggle with. So uh, it may be close, but not exactly on point. But let me maybe talk very briefly about my experience on the NIH Human Embryo Research Panel. This goes back to the 90s, and it was during the first Clinton term. Um, the NIH had not been able to fund research that involved human embryos during the preceding Reagan, Bush Senior administrations. And suddenly now under Clinton, they could, but they didn't know what they should or shouldn't do. And they appointed an embryo panel and gave us, I think it's kind of hilarious, 9 months to come up with a report
Nice.
on what their funding rules should be for what is allowed and not allowed with NIH monies. This is before the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, so it's before that federal limitation. And this committee spent an awful lot of time trying to come up with something that was going to be based around the idea of the moral status of the embryo. And it came up with a set of guidelines that had to do with developmental stages. You can do research until this stage, but not after that stage. And I remember we got a very mixed reaction to this report. And by the way, this report is what then led to the Dickey-Wicker Amendment as kind of a rejection of this report and a rejection of President Clinton in some ways. But I wrote afterwards about how I thought that we'd made a fundamental mistake because we had tried to tie the policy to moral philosophy. And I thought, there's some things where there's simply never going to be an answer. That there are certain things that are not going to be reconcilable. People are not going to agree on a theory of morality or moral status of the embryo because no theory is bulletproof. But what we needed instead was not moral philosophy, but political philosophy. If you're asking the question not about whether something is right or wrong for an individual to do, but if it's right or wrong as a policy matter, we should be talking about political philosophy. And here I said we should be looking at what would be a morally acceptable way to set policy. And so I would say, let's look at justice issues. Let's look at who benefits and who is disadvantaged, who is morally offended and who is benefited. And if something is going to be benefiting one group and offending another, does the offended group get any benefit at all? Or is it now that the offended people get nothing? Right? So if you're talking about research that might cure cancer, and some of the research is offensive to people because it involves using fetal tissue from aborted fetuses, at least those people who were offended by it also may benefit from the medical technology. But if it's on new contraceptions and the people who are offended by new contraceptives are also people who never use contraception, that's a different kind of problem in terms of the distribution of, let's say, benefit and pain, where pain includes political pain or moral pain. It goes to Caleb's questions about the pricing and, if the technology goes forward, is it going to go forward in a manner that is geographically and economically and socially accessible to a broad portion of the population, or does it only serve one part of the population? Is it being done in a way that is as limited in its offense or in its imposition of risks as possible? Or are we being careless about offending and risking? And that we should be thinking about setting policy with these parameters in mind. Right? This is not about whether something's right or wrong. It's about how you create a kind of philosophy of compromise that goes to making public policy in a world in which you're hoping to keep society civil, which is a challenge. But I will say also that I do have my biases. I was trying not to embed them in everything I said, but of course I have my biases. You know, many years ago, it turned out it's Time magazine. I used to think it was Newsweek. Time magazine had something that tried to sum up national cultures. And they said, in the United States, everything is permitted until it's prohibited. And by contrast, in East Germany, which still existed then, everything is prohibited until it's permitted. These are two very different approaches to things. And then they went on, and I love them for this, that in the Soviet Union, everything's prohibited, especially if it's permitted. And in Italy, everything's permitted, especially if it's prohibited. So I thought that they had actually captured something delicious there. But it also captured something fundamental. My bias absolutely is that things should be permitted to go forward until there is a justification for restricting them. And then you restrict them as lightly as possible through regulation as opposed to prohibition. There are others who really do believe things should be prohibited until you can prove that they're needed and that it's fine to prohibit new technologies, whether it's, heritable editing or it's cloning or you name it, until somebody can prove that it absolutely has to be permitted. And it's just a different orientation. And in some ways, I think it tells you where the policy is going to go more than the technology and the applications themselves, because most things are going to have both benefits and risks. They'll have advantages and disadvantages. And how you weigh permissibility and how open you are to serendipitous changes in society and social morality will determine how you react to the technologies more than the particularity of the technology.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you very much. I could probably follow up for hours because it was very provocative, but I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
The best I can do.
Dr.
Thank you.
Charo, that was great. And I think a good place to turn things back over to Dr. Kubler. You have many more questions that I could have asked of you, and I might send those to you in an email just so you know what our colleagues and friends were asking
Sure.
here. But thank you everybody for participating. Dr.
Well, thank
Kubler,
you for
back
your
to you.
attention. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Charo, for helping us understand how technology and public policy have shaped human reproduction. And once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Beaver for moderating our discussion. And I thank you, our participants, for fantastic questions and engagement. You can't know how enriching this is, at least for me personally, that we have great attendance and great questions coming from all of our participants. A recording of this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website through the magic of Jonathan Beaver and his editing capabilities. So you'll be able to view it again and again and share it with others. I know some people may have joined late and you want to hear the beginning, and believe me, every minute of it is worth it. So please do so. And there you'll also find links to past talks and information on upcoming presentations in ethically speaking. So in that vein, let me tell you about our next event and give me a moment to share screen. This always takes me a little bit longer than it should, but I think it's working there. Is that working, Dr. Beaver? Excellent. So, okay, as humans, we think of ourselves as self-deterministic and responsible for our own actions and able to exercise free will. Yet, the more we learn about the mind and human cognition, and the more we understand then that there are complex structures and neurological circuits and biochemistry that underpin thinking. And many thinkers have suggested that our sense of self is really just a complex manifestation of those underlying biochemical and neurological processes. But Dr. Robert M. Sapolsky takes this thinking a step further, and he asserts rather boldly that these structures are so deterministic that humans, in fact, do not have free will. Dr. Sapolsky is the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor of Biology, Neurology, and Neurosurgery at Stanford University, and he's a research associate at the National Museums of Kenya. His books include Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Worst and Best, and most recently, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. You do not want to miss Dr. Sapolsky's talk, so please visit the UCF Center for Ethics webpage now and register for the event. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the National Science Foundation and the many UCF partners that you see listed here, and I'd like to thank them all for helping bring this series to you. Lastly, thank you to all our speakers, Dr. Charo today, and for you, our participants, for making this possible and as exciting as it is for me, at least. We hope you'll join us for future presentations of Ethically Speaking, so we benefit from your questions and participation there.